Howdy, all of you delicious people. I'm here today to view Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. Automobiles? Automobiles. Funny enough, does anybody remember 16 Candles? The one scene with Long Duck Dong where the guy is like, "Where's my automobile?" And we have Long Duck Dong who's like, "Automobile?" mocking him. And he ends up stating that it's like, "Crah." And so because of course we had Long Duck Dong who had gotten so drunk the night before with that really muscular woman that I was like, dang, like that girl was freaking impressive. I was like, that's a woman there. So so it just reminds me of a time where people used to say automobiles, but it's always just like car or vehicle or any number of other things because it's just shorter or briefer or whichever. So, Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. This seems to be the Thanksgiving movie that everyone is kind of watching right now. So I was like, well, hey, like, I don't ever think I've fully seen this film, so I wanted to finally give it a try. I want to finally give it a go. This movie also reminds me of the Steve Martin Goldie Hawn movie Out of Towners. Just kind of reminds me of that like certain kind of chemistry between the two actors, and just the horribly awry adventure, and also that it was a Steve Martin movie, as well as I think there's also another Steve Martin Goldie Hawn film. I think at some point I want to call it like Babysitters, but I'm not quite sure about that. You can correct me if you'd like. So speaking of chemistry, the chemistry between Steve Martin, who plays Neil Page, and John Candy, who plays Del Griffith, who's almost close to my last name, is to really be great here. It feels like these two have just known one another forever, even though they just met. It feels like they're like old pals. And so teeing up what is going on in this film. So we have two characters, both Neil and Del, who continue to bump into one another no matter what they're doing. For some way or another, they're both going to Chicago, and so both of them are trying to go on into the same modes of transportation to try and get to Chicago. And while they keep bumping into one another, horrible things continue to happen. And so they realize that they just need to partner up. That really, like, the best way that they can get home is just relying on one or another for whoever is to go on and have a wallet or a credit card or some kind of money to their name. Because it gets down to that, really. So we go into this film, and every bit of things that these guys try to get home because they want to get home for Thanksgiving, come to find out we have planes that end up either because of bad weather needing to land early or get delayed. We have trains that all of a sudden are smoking from the engine of it. We go on to forcibly have Neil and Del needing to even rent a car through a company named Marathon, which when finally we get Neil who has to rent a car, he has just lost it by that point. He has a meltdown in front of the Marathon lady. And it's like, F this and F that, F. And so in retort, the rental car lady at Marathon is like, yeah, you're effed. If you don't have the one ticket, you're effed. So we have both Neil and Del that figure out some magical way to get to their destination without getting arrested because man, does it get pretty dang close. There's a lot of mistakes to be made, and it was also really interesting because the one part where John Candy is kind of driving by himself while like Steve Martin is just kind of sleeping in the side, we all of a sudden have Dell that goes on and is to be listening to this song called Mess Around, and like he's doing all these like piano things and he's having a really good time. He's playing the saxophone and whatever. I'm like, haven't I seen this scene before? Like, wasn't it on like some like Family Guy episode or something like that? And immediately I was just like, okay, somebody must have just stole this scene from somewhere, because I've seen it somewhere else. Maybe the exact same scene. I don't know. It might have been the episode where both Stewie and Brian go on the road trip together, and Stewie picks a car that doesn't show dirt. From whatever way that I remember that is, however I remember that. So, with that said, let's get into hopefully just remembering what ends up happening in this film, because there's some interesting, funny dialogue that kind of goes on throughout this movie. Also, like, there's some pretty big stars that end up playing some kind of small roles here. We have, like, Kevin Bacon, who ends up having this race with Steve Martin to get to this taxi. We have Michael McCain that ends up playing a state trooper here. We have Lila Robbins, who plays Susan Page, Neil Page's wife. And so I was like, yeah, like, this is really interesting how this all kind of just plays out. So without a doubt, I think it's about that time to just go into just spoilers. Let me know in the comments below how you felt about Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. If you went on and just kind of watched it after me stating that this movie is actually a really fun movie. I would state that, oh man, this is kind of hard to like really grade this movie. I'd probably state that it is, I want to say that it's like almost like a solid good film, if not better than that. So I would definitely have a lot of people check it out. There might be better road trip movies. Like I had just recently seen Dutch, and I really liked that. But yeah, but I thought that this movie was also pretty dang good. Where can you go on and see Planes, Trains, and Automobiles? Currently, it's available on AMC Plus, or it seems that there's a number of goofy, weird apps that you probably never have heard of. But speaking of apps you've probably never gone on and heard of, I will also help you go on to find a number of apps that you would be able to see this movie for absolutely free without any subscription of any kind. First off would be an app called Doxy, DOXCY. You can justifiably see this movie and a number of other things for absolutely free. Like I just watched Power Rangers the night before because, of course, like I wanted to go on and just kind of watch some Power Rangers episodes, because why not? You can also go on to another app called Play UHD. Those are two words. So if you search Play UHD, you'll find an app that in fact has a logo, Fox HD Movies, and you can hopefully be able to go on and find Planes, Trains, and Automobiles for absolutely free. The next apps, they kind of lessen in degree of how well you can find them, but I'll recommend them anyways, because maybe they'll exist in some kind of better way at some point. So, 123 Movies. You could probably go on through the Google Play Store and find 123 Movies, but you need to find the app that it legitimately works. You can access the content or access servers, because sometimes that doesn't work. So, hopefully you'll go on and find an app that does. And so with that said, let's go into the last app. Yes Movies. I think there is some Yes Movies available in the Google Play Store. Maybe you'll also go on and find a format of Yes Movies that kind of works also, that isn't called Yes Movie. I don't know. You'll figure it out at some point, maybe. Someday. Anyways. So yeah, so I think it's about that time to just go into the double 5 time territory. I think it is that time yet again to, of course, go into what is, of course, called spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time to spoil this movie. So, at the very beginning of the film, we, of course, have Steve Martin, who is Neil Page, who is in this meeting, this magazine company meeting, where we have this guy who's just kind of thumbing through these certain pictures. It's just like, like, I don't know which one is gonna go on page 47 of some magazine somewhere. And so the guy's like, And so Neil is looking at John next to him, and he's like, I need to leave. I need to get out of here. I gotta go and catch my plane. Like, this guy who's just sitting around just with his thumb up his butt, like, we're getting nowhere. Help me. Someone help me. That's not all of what he says, but I'm paraphrasing. And so the guy takes like 12 years to figure out what photo to pick, and he doesn't even pick one. He's just like, oh no, like let's just have like this being chosen after the holiday break. And so both John and Neil are scrambling out of there because Neil's like, yeah, I'm gonna make it on this plane, like, let's go, da da da. So we, of course, have Neil going to John and be like, okay, like, hopefully I'm just going to get home and everything will be easy breezy. So Neil goes on to his elevator as John is to say, I think this one's yours. So Neil rushes to get out of his job to then rush on to find a way to get to an airport. So Neil all of a sudden is seeing a taxi racer in the streets next to, or in the sidewalk next to him. And so come to find out that is none other than Kevin Bacon. So we have both Steve Martin and Kevin Bacon that are both looking, because Kevin Bacon doesn't have a name in this movie. He's called the Taxi Racer for whatever goofy reason. So we have Neil that is like both of their eyes have met and they realize there's one taxi available. So they're running through the streets of, I'm assuming, New York. And we have at one point where Neil gets stopped by this dancer. We have Kevin Bacon getting stopped by these boxes that are being kind of carted out. So Neil is thinking like, yeah, I'm going to get to the taxi before he will. And so by the time we all of a sudden see Neil getting closer and closer to this taxi, we then realize that there's another guy who's like, excuse me, I have this taxi. And we, of course, have Neil that tries to pay him off to try and buy off the taxi. And he's like, well, hey, like, this is the holidays. It's like, don't you have a heart? And the guy's like, no, I don't. Sucks to be you. So by the time that Neil pays this guy off by giving him $75, we all of a sudden realize someone else had already commandeered this guy's taxi, who, of course, is Del Griffith, who is, of course, played by John Candy. So we all of a sudden have Neil, who is running off to get to this taxi, and when Neil finally catches the taxi and pulls the door open, we then have Del, who ends up getting frightened by the sight of Neil. And so Neil's like, well, hey, like, you stole my taxi. And Del just kind of shuts the door and the taxi keeps on driving. So Neil realizes that he's like, okay, well, I'm effed. I'm just going to have to find some taxi somewhere. So Neil finally gets his taxi, makes it to the airport, gets his ticket, and come to find out he's getting a later flight because his 6 o'clock plane was to not have him be able to get to that. So he has to, I think, take a 10 o'clock. So when Neil is to be waiting to get boarded on his plane, right next to him we go on and see Del Griffith. And Neil is looking over there and just like, where do I know this guy from? He looks so familiar. And then Neil's like, oh yeah, taxi cab guy. As we see the image right in front of him, he's like, oh, like, I hate this guy. And so we all of a sudden have Del who turns to Neil. It's like, well, hey, like, don't I know you from somewhere? Like, your face, you just look so familiar. And so Neil's like, yeah, you stole my taxi. And Del is like, huh? Oh, yeah, you were that guy that scared the crap out of me. Oh, yeah. So, come to find out by the time both Neil and Del get on this plane, we come to find out that Neil had been downgraded to coach instead of first class, and he wasn't told. So now Neil is going on to find his seat. Quinkadinkly, it ends up being right next to Del. So Neil is between Del and some other old man. Sadly enough, he probably doesn't have an actual name. And so Neil is having two people like sleep on him. And so when bizarrely like Del is kind of sleeping, it's like Del goes on to tell Neil, it's like, well, I bet we're not going to make it to Chicago. And then he falls back asleep. So come to find out, the plane has to make a stop and can't make it to Chicago because of the horrible weather. So these guys are in Wichita. Wichita, Kansas? Is it Kansas? I don't know Wichita, or I don't know Kansas all that well, so let me know in the comments below. I only remember from like Zombieland, somebody saying Wichita at some point, but to each their own. So Neil and Del, we have the two of them, and so Neil is to go on and tell his wife, like, I don't know if I'm going to be able to get to Chicago, like I'm trying, I don't think I'm going to get there. And Del tells Neil, it's like, yeah, I think you're going to go on and get stuck here. Because there's no way to get a plane, like, because the last plane to get to Chicago is delayed because of weather. We also had Del on the plane who goes on to take off his shoes and his socks, and he's like, oh, my dogs are barking. Ah. And so Neil is just like, oh my god, this guy's foot just smells like the heavens. And not in a good way. So, we have Neil who goes on, is like desperately trying to call some hotel somewhere, and everybody is booked because of the weather. So we have Neil going on and talking to Del, and Del goes on and has this whole like catchphrase where he's talking about his work and his family, where he states, it's like, well, like your job, but love your wife. And so Neil is just like, yeah. So we have Del that states to Neil, it's like, well, hey, while you were calling your wife, I was calling the Braidwood Inn. The Braidwood Inn? Is that... So, the Braidwood? I'm going to go with Braidwood. It sounds better. For my sake. So, we have, of course, Del who's like, well, hey, you're welcome to share my room. And so Neil is like, great, because there's nowhere else I can go. So, weirdly enough, we have this unusual taxi, and this guy is taking his sweet time to drive them around everywhere, because this guy is like, well, yeah, like, I'm really proud of my town, so I want to show you every bit of it. So Neil's like, couldn't he have gone on and taken the interstate? And Del is like, no, he's just proud of his town. Like, let him go. So, yeah, let him go when you don't know how much the price is going to cost for you to get out of that taxi. So, that cab. So they go to the Braidwood Inn, and we have the two of them that get a room, and this room, of course, is to be a one bed. And like John Candy just looks at Steve Martin and is like, like gives him like the weirdest face. So Dell goes in there and is to like put together the bed, and Neil goes in to get to the shower first, as they bizarrely have this like weird way of dipping for the shower. As Dell's like, well, hey, do you want a shower? And Neil's like, well, yeah, but not with. And like Dell's like, no, that's not what I meant. So Neil goes into the shower, and Dell is now messing with the bed that I guess when you put a quarter in, it all of a sudden vibrates. So Neil goes in to take this shower, and come to find out, like, in all honesty, Dell's character is such a slop. Just being honest, like, there is so much of his crap that is all over the gosh darn place. It's ridiculous. So we have Neil that goes on to like have the water just turn off and on, and when it does turn back on, it ends up like hitting him, and not in a good way. So Neil needs to find a towelette or a thing to just wash his face off, and we end up having him find this one like tiniest of towel that would probably fit my hand, because it would be, of course, a smaller like washcloth. So Neil goes on and is to desperately like try to like touch his face with this towel, and then kind of like tries to get like the rest of his body awkwardly. So we then have Neil and Dell, who are to now have to sleep in the same bed, and come to find out Dell had gotten beers for the both of them, but when Dell puts it in the vibrating bed, somehow the beers just explode, and now half of the bed is covered in beer. So, funny enough, that like never comes up in any of the rest of the part of the movie. Uh, and we also have Neil, who ends up stating that he's had like the same underwear on for days on end. But so we have Neil and Dell bickering about the beer, but there's nothing they can do. It's like, well, hey, we could switch sides, and Neil's like, no, like, that's fine. So Dell is also talking about how like he can't switch pills with him either, because he has an allergy. So we have Neil trying to go to bed, and Dell is like clearing his throat. He's like, and I'm like, what the fuck? I would have gotten irritated by that too. So Neil just finally gets up and just starts lashing out at Dell by just stating that Dell just never stops. When both of them are on the plane together, like Dell was just nom 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 nom. And so Neil was just like, you know what, like, if you ever have a story, like, get to a point to any of them. And so Neil is trying to go on and just berate Dell, and so Dell just kind of takes it and is like, okay, like, all right. But it is kind of interesting how Dell tries to fire back at Neil, but he doesn't really have anything negative to really say about Neil. So when we finally have Dell that speaks up. But so they finally just find a way to go to sleep, and we all of a sudden have some thief that breaks into their place and steals all the money out of their wallets, and doesn't take their credit cards because, like, leave them something to just pay for, or be able to pay their way through their vacation somehow. So we have Neil and Del that wake up the next morning, and all of a sudden they're like almost like spooning one another. And so when all of a sudden they wake up, they realize it's like, well, hey, like, Del, why are you kissing me on the cheek? And Del's like, oh my god, all right, like. So they both get up, and all of a sudden they're talking about how about them Bears, right? Yeah, yeah, they're gonna do well this year. Yeah, they are. Yeah. So Neil goes back in the bathroom and is to all of a sudden kind of crank the sink, and Neil is kind of grabbing for this water and putting it on his face. Then he realizes that there, of course, is to be like socks in the sink. And so Del yells out to Neil, it's like, well, hey, like, if you're going to go on and you're going to you're going to brush your teeth, like, make sure you take my socks out of the sink. And so Neil is to go on, like, oh my God, I just have, like, sock on my face. Like, the smell of it. So all of a sudden, Neil tries to grab this washcloth, and it ends up being, of course, Del's underwear. And Del, so Neil, she's like, oh my God. Could you just imagine if Neil was like OCD and like every bit of this was just like, oh my God. So Neil goes on to just like, okay, like, let's get out of here. Let's go to a diner somewhere. Let's get something to eat. So we at this inn was to also find out that Neil and Del were to switch credit cards somehow. And so when they go into this diner and they are to have Neil just kind of start paying for everything, and Del is like, wow, like I feel like such a like a leech, like you're going on and you're paying for everything. And Neil's like, no, 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 like, hopefully this is gonna be the last time I ever see you again. So we have Neil and we have Del, and Neil starts looking through his wallet and realizes that like $800 is gone. And so immediately Neil turns to Del. It's like, you stole from my wallet. And Del is like, no. And so Del puts out his wallet and says that there's like 270 something dollars that I think in there. And so if there's any more than that, then Neil should go on and just kind of thumb through it. Neil looks through Del's wallet and it's like, well, I guess we were robbed. I guess we've been had. But they didn't go on and take the credit cards. So Del just makes a clear consensus is like, well, like, then all we should just do then is just charge our way home. Just like use our credit cards and just do that. Because that'll hopefully just work out. So both of the two of them are at this diner, and so come to find out, Del is to know somebody, some I think relative of his or someone, and they have this guy who picks him up, and it's a guy named Owen who has a lot of chew, and he's just like, hey. Hey. Like, so weirdly enough, we even have him at one point, which is the grossest thing. And he, like, when he spits, like, his hand catches it, and then he shakes his hand with somebody. I'm like, gross. Man, Dylan Baker was good here. So we all of a sudden have Owen's wife, who is holding a baby, hands off her baby to some kid. And we have the wife that goes on and is to grab all their luggage. And so, like, both Neil and Del are like, hey, you don't need to get your wife to take our luggage. And Owen's like, well, hey, like, my wife delivered a baby horizontal. And so, like, and she didn't yell once. So it's like, oh my God. So we see both Neil and Del that are in the back of this truck because there's no room in any other part of the truck. So we have Neil who turns to Del and states like, "Well, hey, like, how cold is it?" And Del is like, "Well, it's probably like 1 degrees out." So by the time that they finally get to their destination, we have both Neil and we have both Del. They're just like, oh, blah, blah, blah. And we also had this dog that just kind of popped out of nowhere. It's like, ha! And it's like, what the? And that dog was also just like, I'm so cold. So the guys get to where they're going, and this, of course, is to, I think, be when they get to the train. So we have both Neil and Del, and so Neil, I think, ends up paying for Del's train ticket, and so Del goes on to be like, man, like, I really appreciate you going on and paying for this, and Neil's like, no, it's no problem. So both of them go into uh, their own separate places, going into this train, and so Neil all of a sudden is talking to this really young girl, and Neil is asking like, "Well, hey, are you like making your way home to Thanksgiving?" And she's like, "Yeah." It's like, "Me too. Yeah, this is great." So the train starts a going, and then all of a sudden it starts a stopping, and the train is like by the engine part of the like the muffler part of the train, whatever that's called, is all of a sudden starting to smoke. So we realize that now everybody has to get off the train, and so both of these people are just like, oh my god, this is the freaking worst. This is the worst. So we, I think, have them in just St. Louis by now. So we have both Neil and Del that only have their credit cards to them. So we have Neil and we have Del, I think, stop at some like another diner, and like, heaven forbid I remember what the conversation is, but I know they head, I think, to another diner, and then they need yet another uh motel to go to, which I think is the El Rancho Hotel or motel. My bad. So Neil and Del by this time are like getting to the point that so many bad things have already happened to them that like they're just wanting to laugh about this. They're wanting to just like have this be such like a joking thing. Oh, no, 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 no. I think the El Rancho Motel is a little bit early. Uh because we have to cover the whole like rent-a-car thing also. So yeah, I think I'm a little bit early. So we have Del and we have Neil that just go on to get these rent-a-cars. I think either way, like, this will work out, but still. So Neil goes on to find a parking lot where he had to get bused to, and Neil was to try to find his car that was in spot V5, and the spot that he goes to is completely empty. Here's also the thing. If this place was like snowed to the ground or whatever, or snow on the ground, how could you tell where the parking spot was? How could you tell which one is V5 or V6 or whatever? Maybe I think there was a sign, but still. So Neil at this point is chasing after this bus that had dropped him off, and now Neil is so ticked off at this point. It's like, you messed with the wrong guy. So Neil has to go on and walk all the way back to this airport to now talk to this marathon renter car girl. And so we have this rental car girl that's like, how's it going today? And Neil's like, get that smug thing off your face. Like, I'm freaking done. Like, F this, F that, F all of you. So, Neil had gone on to state that he had to walk all the way back here, and because the thing that took him there left him. So, he wants his rental car. And so, we have the woman that's going on and saying, let's go, well, do you have your rental car ticket? And Neil is like, no, I don't. So the rental car woman's like, well, you're. So Neil now is just walking off, and he is just had it. So now we have Neil that is talking, I think, to this guy who's like getting all these taxis ready for Neil to kind of get a taxi. So Neil is talking to this guy and has lost his freaking mind and is wanting to just have a fight with this guy. And so the guy punches him in the face. And so Neil falls into the road and almost gets run over by someone's car. Guess who the car is? Of course, this is Dell's car. And so Dell is now like looking at Neil like, oh my god, I almost just ran you over. So we have Dell that is looking at the guy that kind of knocked Neil over. And so Dell is stating like, well, hey, how about you help this guy up? And the guy's like, with pleasure, and he grabs him by the nuts, and Neil is now, for the rest of the time that he's with Dell in this rental car, he's like, he's like talking like a little child, he's on helium. So, both Neil and Dell are driving off, and so now that they're on this journey together, they finally get to the El Rancho Motel, and at this point, they're just like, hey, we should just be, like, laughing about this at this point. Because we also have the scene where Steve is trying to go on and get some sleep, or Neil is, and so Dell is trying to drive to find this other motel, or drive to just continue to drive, and all of a sudden, we have at one point where Dell is to have this cigarette, and he loses the cigarette in the back seat, and Dell all of a sudden starts to realize that the car is getting really hot. Dell is desperately trying to take off his coat, but every time he takes off his coat, he ends up latching it onto some part of this car seat. Some hook, something. So, when Dell tries to desperately get his hand like yanked out of these spots, we have both hands that both get yanked into the back of the seat, and so he's just kind of just pushing with both hands trying to get his coat like off of him so he can drive this car. And so he's desperately like using his legs and using like every part of his body to continue to be able to drive. So we all of a sudden have both Neil and Dell that like spin around in this car. And so we all of a sudden have like Neil that is to wake up and ask Dell, it's like, hey man, it's getting kind of hot in here, you should probably get your coat off. And Dell's like, yeah, that's what I was trying to do. So we have Neil and we have Dell, and they continue to drive in the wrong direction. And so the car that is next to him is like, hey, you're going the wrong way, you're going the wrong direction, you're gonna kill somebody. And they're like, and so Neil ends up kind of rolling down the window because it's a really old film. So Neil is looking at these people and is like, what are they saying? It's like, you're going the wrong way, you're going the wrong direction. And Neil turns to Del. It's like, what do you think they're talking about? Del's like, I don't know. I think they're drunks. And so he goes like this, like, like you're drinking. You don't know what you're talking about. So all of a sudden, both Neil and Del are driving, and we have these two semis, and they luckily have this car go right in between the two semis, and we have the whole sides of the car just scraped. So both Neil and Del are to like thank their lucky stars that they were still alive after that. So all of a sudden, right after that, after they finally park the car, they both get out of the car and they're both talking. We all of a sudden notice, like, and this is to also feel like quite similar to, God, what was it? Tommy Boy? Like this whole situation here with like the deer that they end up getting like they end up having a car accident with the deer, and then the deer just kind of tears through the car and gets out of the car, and then they have all these like tape and all this stuff just kind of keeping the car just together, and it ends up being I think it ends up being David Spade's car. But anyways, back to the film. We have Neil and we have Del, and now the car is on fire. And so now both Neil and Del are talking about, like, well, hey, what should they go on and do next? And Neil's looking at Del, it's like, man, your insurance is going to love you. Like, because of this whole rental car thing. Or all the marathon people are going to love you. Yeah, you're going to have to buy them a whole new car. So, come to find out, Neil had put his wallet in the glove compartment. And so now we have both Del and we have both Neil. And so Neil asked Del, it's like, well, hey, how did you go on and afford this rental car? And Del is like, well, like, I just so happened to find your credit card in my wallet. And so Neil's like, what? So Neil tells Del, it's like, hey, give me back my credit card. And Del is like, well, I already did. And now it's in the glove compartment that's burning up. So Neil's like, oh my God, like, the only one thing that I left is to now be in this car burning up. So they figure out a way to, like, still be able to use the car, but everything about the car really doesn't work at this point. So we have Neil and we have Del that are still driving this car. So they get to El Rancho and come to find out, like, Neil is just kind of giving this guy this, like, card that barely looks like a card and all these things, and the guy's looking at him, it's like he had like $17 to him. We had Del, who luckily, like, he was to sell all of these like shower curtain things, like the rods, the little like circular things, to all these people, and he kept like telling them how they were like rare earrings and all these things to just like lie to everyone to have him like buy all these things. So they at some point gotten to this room, and now they're both all laughing, and so they're sharing like Doritos and beer, and we have Neil who's like, well, is this a good combination? Del's like, I don't know, but like, we're just gonna go on and just laugh about all this because of how like poorly this trip has all gone. So we come to find out the next day, we have the guys now needing to try to get this car out of this parking lot, and come to find out the car is stuck in snow. So Steve, or Neil, is trying to give it the old college try, the real push, and so Del is thinking that he needs to go on and kind of rock it back and forth. Come to find out, Del rocks it so far back that ended up smashing into their hotel room, and so now that Del can go on and drive this car off, we have Del that's calling, Neil, get in here, hurry up. Like, we're just going to run out of here. this guy technically might have. Well, they paid with like money. They paid with like cash. So, anyways, they they drive off, and they really just get to a point where they're stopped by this state trooper, because both Neil and Dell don't know how fast they're going. So we have this state trooper that pulls them over. It's like, do you know how fast you're going, sir? And Dell is like, well, honestly, like, my speedometer has melted, so I honestly have no clue. So the state trooper goes on and like, sir, you're going like 78 miles an hour. It's like Dell's like, oh, I guess I was going that fast. So the state trooper goes on to notice, it's like, well, hey, like, there's so much about this car that like doesn't work, or like nothing about this car is like really drivable. So like, sirs, I'm gonna have to like have you surrender this car. And Dell tries to tell the state trooper, it's like, well, hey, man, like, I really just need to get this guy, like, to his family on Thanksgiving. And the state trooper does not give a single F. So, Dell and Neil realize that they're out of luck here. So, we have both Neil and we have both Dell that end up having a semi truck driver that is to let them kind of drive in their car to make their way to Chicago. This scene kind of reminds me of like Home Alone, when I think both John Candy and the mother of that movie, like, they're both in the back of the semi truck, and John Candy and his band are also there, and they're all like playing these songs, just like, hey, yeah, like, you play this, you play the clarinet, you see. Like, it just reminds me of that whole scene. So come to find out, both Neil and Dell are not actually going to sit in the semi. They're going to sit in the trailer of it, the back of it. So come to find out, they're sitting next to a bunch of Ashkenagin cheese, whatever that means. So we have the Ashkenagin cheese, and we have both Neil and Dell, and they're just in the back of this, and they're just like, oh my god, like, this is the worst. So we finally have these guys with the ability to make their way finally with this cab, or with this maybe another renter car. I don't remember which one it is. And so we have the two of them finally making their way to this kind of like light rail, or kind of like subway. So we have Neil going on and is to get into this subway, and we all of a sudden have Neil, who finally separates with Dell, and Neil's on the subway, and he's just like, okay, like, wait a minute, like, Neil starts to recount everything that Dell has ever said. And so Dell, at some point, like, what triggers is he's like talking about his family, but he also states that he hasn't been home in years. And so, like, he has all these sayings, and when Neil is to talk to Dell about, like, well, hey, at least you have a wife to come home to, and Dell's like, yes, I do have a wife to come home to. But you can see on his face. So Neil realizes that, like, he has to run back to Dell, and Dell is just sitting in the station. And so Neil asks Dell, it's like, why are you sitting in this station? And Dell's like, well, I don't really have a home. So Neil's like, well, you're coming home with me. We're gonna share turkey together. So let's go. So both of them end up getting, I'm assuming it's a cab or a car or something. So they make their way to to get home. And so finally, when they get home, there's also this part where Susan Page was talking to her kids in the early part of the film and talking about certain family members that either go on and give them Indian burns or noogies. And we had like the one kid who's like, well, I'd rather have noogies than Indian burns, because there's some relative that, of course, is coming, that they always just get like crap from. So little Neil and who is the other girl? Marty? Let's go with Marty. So by the end of this, we have Neil and Dell that come home. And so now we, of course, have Neil who is having Dell meet with Susan. And now that it seems that they finally made it home, that's when the movie just kind of ends. And we end with John Candy smiling, which was great. It was a great way to end the film. And plus, although this, like, we had this movie kind of like mimic the ending of like Uncle Buck, where when the oldest like daughter ends up seeing her mother, the oldest daughter like rushes to her mother and hugs her. It's like, oh my god, like wow, like she actually missed me. She actually cared. And really, because this girl has realized that like family is more important than just some guy named Bug. So yeah, so we had a good ending to this film. These guys made it. And so with that said, I think I'm going to make my way out of here. Let me know in the comments below if there's anything that I forgot about, because I'm sure there might have been something that I got out of order. That tends to happen. I make mistakes. But at least I would know the events, but not exactly in the perfect order of which that they went. But at least I was going on and state a pretty good portion of this film. With that said, I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.